Berman.
Yeah, we're gonna miss you, but we're glad you're here today.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we're gonna get started. We're gonna honor our time. I have 9:46, and I know the rain will drag a few more of us in, maybe a little bit later, but we're glad those who are here. And we're so glad that those who are joining us online are with us, even from California, Wendy. So thank you for being here, Bobby and Wendy and Norville. We're going to start our time this morning with a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, on this rainy day, we come before you, gathered in your warmth, in your love, in your care as your community. And we pray, Lord, that as we discuss and learn and listen and share about grief, about things that may be heavy on our hearts and our lives and our world, we know that you carry our grief, that we may cast our cares on you, and you are there. So we pray, Lord, that your spirit would animate our spirits, that we would rest in your care, that we would know you are here. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Are you recording this?
Yes.
Thank you.
Is that right? Yes.
I would like to.
Okay.
Great.
So my stepmother sent me some things that she came across at home from as she was going through papers after my father's death. And one of the things she sent me was this paper on grief that my father had written for, I think it was for a probate judges convention, maybe. And as I was reading through it, it seemed this was written back, I think, in 1995. It just seemed very relevant to even today. So some of the insights on dealing with grief and some of the thoughts that he was musing on were still relevant, I felt. And so I thought this would be something appropriate to share on Stephen Ministry Sunday, as we have this vital Stephen ministry here in our church with folks who take seriously that idea of Christian caregiving and walking alongside with those who may be grieving or carrying heavy burdens. And so the format for today will be, I'm going to just give his paper, his presentation. It's about 25 minutes, and then we'll discuss it. What was salient, what was informative, what do you sort of wrestle with from what you heard, what doesn't seem appropriate anymore, what resonated. And then Bob and Karen and Sherry will share some of the Stephen Ministry resources that we have accessible here for folks that we can use to lift up, share with one another, share with others. They are all excellent resources themselves on this topic. And then we have some actual tangible resources to share on the topic. So that's sort of how we'll proceed. There'll definitely be time for discussion and conversation, but we'll start sort of with this paper preview. So my dad gives this introduction. I lost my beloved wife, Beverly, after 35 years of marriage, October 1, 1992. We met my senior year of college and married after I graduated law school. We had 4 children. Our oldest son, Timothy, died June 4, 1981, at the age of 21, his junior year of college. So I feel I have some credentials to talk about grief. When I use the I, it's my dad, obviously. The talk is in 4 parts. There's an overview first, part 1. Part 2 are some writers' viewpoints. Part 3 are my insights. And part 4 are tips for helping a grieving friend. Welcome, Del. Part 1, our overview. Grief is a unifying human experience rising from the depths of the human condition we all share. Regardless of race, social class, economic status, religion, or gender, all people experience grief. While grief isolates us, it's also one experience that unites all of us, person to person. Loving is an intense attachment to another. Grieving is the time when our physical relationship with a loved one becomes one of memory. Poets tell us grieving is nature's way of healing a broken heart. Typically, grief lasts 6 to 36 months, but there's no finish line. Any situation that leads to major loss, death, divorce, serious injury, natural disaster, usually produces the process of grief. So grief is deep sorrow caused by unusual loss. We understand that grief is normal, grief is human. Understanding the grief process can help us to accept our grieving friends, our grieving clients, where folks are in their feelings. It can also help us understand and accept our grieving selves. That's part one, the overview. Part two, grief from scholars and writers' viewpoints. According to Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her book on Death and Dying from 1969, the grief process consists of 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Personally, I haven't found these stages helpful, except to use to dissect, discuss, and analyze grief. My own experience is that the so-called stages are more semantic than real. I can have denial at one level and acceptance at another, along with grief and depression all at the same time. Or I can skip bargaining altogether, since death of a spouse is a fait accompli, and I don't have many cards left to bargain with. But I'm sure the good doctor intended bargaining to mean that before the death, one can bargain with God or whoever. In A Grief Observed, a book written by C.S. Lewis, the famous Anglican writer, after the death of his wife in 1961, he describes how his grief feels. And this is also expressed in the movie Shadowlands, which you may have seen. So he quotes Lewis here. This is C.S. Lewis from A Grief Observed. "No one ever told me grief felt so like fear. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. I keep on swallowing. At other times, it feels like being mildly drunk. There's a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says. I dread the moments when the house is empty. There are moments, most unexpectedly, when something inside me tried to reassure me that I don't really mind so much, not so very much after all. Love is not the whole of a man's life. I was happy before I ever met her. I have plenty of what are called resources. People get over things." Then comes a sudden jab of red-hot memory, and all this common sense vanishes like the ant in the mouth of a furnace. On the rebound, one passes into tears and pathos, maudlin tears. I almost prefer the moments of agony. These are at least clean and honest. Meanwhile, where is God? Go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain. And what do you find? A door slammed in your face and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. That's Lewis's description of how grief feels. One of Beverly's and my friends, Nicholas Woldersdorf of Grand Rapids, Michigan, now teaches at Yale Divinity School, and he's a Christian philosopher. He wrote a book, Lament for a Son, about the death of his 25-year-old son, Eric, in a mountain climbing accident in Austria. And this is how the theologian Woldersdorf describes grief. He says, "I have no explanation. I can do nothing else than endure in the face of this deepest and most painful of mysteries. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth and resurrector of Jesus Christ. I also believe that my son's life was cut off in its prime. I cannot fit these pieces together. I am at a loss. I've read theodicies produced to justify the ways of God to man. I find them unconvincing. To the most agonized questions I have ever asked, I do not know the answer. I do not know why God would watch him fall. I do not know why God would watch me wounded. I cannot even guess. I'm not angry, but I'm baffled and hurt. My wound is an unanswered question. The wounds of all humanity are unanswered questions. That's how Nicholas Wolterstorff describes grief. Or listen to the words of Job in that ancient book, as Job, in the midst of his pain, questions whether or not God cares about justice and mercy, as Job compares his lot with those of the wicked. This is from Job 21, verse 7, and then verses 13 to 16. Why do the wicked live, reach old age, and grow mighty in power? They spend their days in prosperity and in peace go down to Sheol. They say to God, depart from us. We don't desire the knowledge of thy ways. What is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what profit do we get if we pray to him? Behold, is not their prosperity in their hands? The counsel of the wicked is far from me. Job is angry, and with good reason. C.S. Lewis feels abandoned and angry. Nicholas Wolterstorff is more baffled than angry. Anger is often the result of feelings of powerlessness. It's a human way of reacting to the apparent capriciousness and irrationality of tragic events. After Beverly died, I found myself angry at the doctors and hospital personnel for giving her regular chemotherapy while she was literally on her deathbed. I suppose I would have also been angry if I thought the medical establishment didn't try to do enough. So I've read it's healthy to admit anger, reflect on the anger, and try to find meaning in it. Some people get stalled in anger, and they are not exactly fun to be with. For many people, after the death of a loved one, there may be a sense of regret and guilt. The survivor feels, if only I'd done this or that, taken her to the doctor sooner, been a better husband, been a better father, etc. In the golf world, this is known as woulda, shoulda, coulda. My father's sense of humor is sometimes out there. He says, have you seen that gravestone which reads, I told you I was sick? From a personal perspective, in my grieving process, I have no guilt in either tragic loss I've suffered. I have a good friend, an attorney who was estranged from his father. When his father died a few years ago, my friend, instead of feeling some release, went into depression, which was very hard for him to shake. We talked about it, and he and his therapist attributed it to the fact that he never tried to reconcile with his father, and now he was left with guilt, regret, and depression. Listen to an untitled poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay. Time does not bring relief. You all have lied who told me time would ease me of my pain. I miss him in the weeping of the rain. I want him at the shrinking of the tide. The old snows melt from every mountainside, and last year's leaves are smoke in every lane. But last year's bitter loving must remain heaped on my heart, and my old thoughts abide. There are 100 places where I fear to go. So with his memory they brim, and entering with relief some quiet place where never fell his foot or shone his face, I say, There is no memory of him here. And so stand stricken. So remembering him. The term depression covers a number of situations, including clinical depression, which is best treated with medication, or other forms, such as a young man who knows he has a month to live, has every right to be sad, or one that sets in response to a major loss, such as a middle-aged woman whose husband dies suddenly, is faced with economic loss, increased childcare responsibilities, financial responsibilities, as well as the loss of a longtime companion, the effects of which can be debilitating and produce depression. Depression isn't like the abyss from which one climbs out of, but rather I think of it and the whole grieving process, unlike Kubler-Ross, as a spiral that keeps turning back on itself with varying degrees of intensity, but slowly the trend is up. Not like the ladder which one climbs up in a straight line. C.S. Lewis, in A Grief Observed, wrote about comments from friends who said he was getting over the grief of his wife's death, that he'd come to acceptance in Kubler-Ross's jargon. And this is what Lewis has to say about that. Getting over it so soon, but the words are ambiguous. To say the patient is getting over it after an operation for appendicitis is one thing, but after he's had his leg cut off is quite another. After that operation, either the wounded stump heals or the man dies. If it heals, the fierce continuous pain will stop. Presently, he'll get back his strength and be able to stump about on his wooden leg. He has got over it, but he will probably have recurrent pains in the stump all his life. There will hardly be any moments when he forgets it. Bathing, dressing, sitting down, getting up, even lying in bed will all be different. All sorts of pleasures and activities he once took for granted will have to be simply written off, duties too. At present, I'm learning to get about on crutches. Perhaps I shall presently be given a wooden leg, but I shall never be a biped again. For us, acceptance means the willingness to live with the reality of our pain. Perhaps holding on to God as the source of comfort, not to the person we've lost. I don't think C.S. Lewis had come to acceptance of his loss when he wrote this. This is now part 3, Insights of John Berman. One thing I'm certain about is that grief is an individualized process. The way we handle it depends on the kind of person we are and the relationship we had with the deceased. Some people handle everything emotionally and intuitively, the right side of the brain. Others are much more rational and analytical. I'm not sure which is preferable. I, like many male lawyers, happen to be the latter. It's quite obvious to me that the nature of the loss is also important. For example, a young woman appeared to probate her husband's will in the probate court. When I expressed condolences, she replied, "The only decent thing that man ever did for me was to die." She was inheriting some property. When I inquired what she meant, she told me what a terrible marriage they had and how she wasn't sorry one bit he'd been killed in an accident. Turns out that a divorce was pending and he'd been abusive during the marriage. I didn't get the impression that there was going to be a difficult grieving process for her. She lost a husband she didn't like, and she gained freedom and financial security. So it's hard to generalize about grieving. This is also true within the family. Each member will grieve differently, which may explain why so many couples, about 75%, divorce after the death of a child, and why it's probably a good idea to get counseling to understand why the others aren't acting appropriately like you are. There's no such thing as automatically getting over a loss. For me, it's not clear whether my maximum improvement will be like recovery from a gash, such as when one has a melanoma removed with skin grafting and a huge scar remaining, or whether it'll be like the loss of a limb, which also heals, but which leaves one more deformed and somewhat less functional, as C.S. Lewis has described it. Clearly, the synergy is gone, i.e. 1 + 1 = 3 in a good marriage. We are better people for being in a good marriage. The spouse covers up our weaknesses, opens up new vistas of life and living, accentuates our good points, and we manage to look and be better than we are simply as individuals. In my case, Beverly was my best friend, supporter, lover, caregiver, not just to me, but to our children. She was a humanizing, softening influence, not to mention the social director, keeping our social relationships in good order. My persona was increased, my ego heightened by being her confidant, helpful critic, helping her in her ministry, listening to her concerns, going over her sermons, both before and after they were given at her request, I might add, bringing home anecdotes, use in her sermons, all of which enabled me to be a supporter and be a part of her career, which I had encouraged. I was on her team and I gloried in her success and happiness. So I find a sense of humor comes in handy. For instance, I tell myself to try and look on the bright side of Beverly's passing. For example, now I can load the dishwasher in the way I please. I don't have to be careful to be sure the dishes don't touch so they won't chip. I can watch TV at night in the bedroom to my heart's content. I don't have to decorate the Christmas tree with the children's tattered decorations from childhood. So I say to myself, look on the bright side. One of the most common questions which used to be asked of me by friends was, how are you doing? I take this question as a friendly sign of caring, but I was a little cautious about my response. Generally, I reply, okay or fine. I do this because I'm quite sure the questioner really didn't want to have me answer them give them an accurate answer. As we know, the grieving process is long and difficult. If I were really feeling fine 3 months after the death of a beloved wife, I might be in denial or out of touch with my feelings and perhaps in need of psychiatric care. Or else I didn't have a happy marriage and much of a relationship with my wife. On the other hand, if I were to answer terrible, that would upset the questioner and not be accurate either. I know the grieving process to be long and painful, and therefore even though I was feeling sad, I was not feeling terrible, as I can understand the fact that I was experiencing suffering, which comes from the loss of a loved one. I was going through the grieving process in an okay manner, which means that 3 months after the death of a beloved wife who died much too young, I was feeling very sad, but that was normal, and that's okay. Obviously, I'm not going to go through this litany with everyone who asks, so it was important for me to fake it by answering fine. I'm okay. Most often, concern was expressed in a social group setting with clear social boundaries and not much time to communicate, such as at a cocktail party or after church coffee. We have our jobs to do, our associates to work with, or other people to chat with, and most of my legal community didn't know Beverly and didn't want to be involved in another's personal problems, even if someone is kind, expresses condolence, and asks, how are you doing? So it was important for me and other grieving persons to have a facade, which enabled us to carry on effectively and efficiently in spite of the grief and save the emotional aspects of grieving for appropriate times, which times translate differently for every grieving person. For me, appropriate times are when I'm alone. But being human, I still have paroxysms of grief at inappropriate times. And when I'm suddenly focused on my loss, or when I'm in a joyous situation, such as with good couple friends or on vacation, and much of grief's manifestations are unexpected and even startling when the paroxysms come, it's also so unpredictable to some extent. And they're usually in situations which bring back experiences which were especially meaningful to Beverly or to us and won't be the same anymore. Fortunately, my wife and I led busy and separate lives. Much as our time together was planned and intentional. Holidays, vacations, Friday night dinner, Saturday afternoons, we didn't have a great deal of loose time to spend together. There wasn't the complete dependence on each other that some couples have, and for this I'm grateful and aware that my grief may not have been as acute as others who were dependent. Now the sharp pain has subsided and a dull ache remains. This is continuing. Okay. Seasons of joy and holidays. How do you think it feels to be grieving during the holiday season? My illustration is that of the wine connoisseur who becomes an alcoholic and then a recovering alcoholic. He accepts the invitation to be with his old buddies at the annual wine tasting party. His friends are bantering and relishing the anticipation as they pass the unopened bottles around. The recovering alcoholic sadly realizes he's feeling uncomfortable and doesn't belong there. What's he doing here? Anyone got any ginger ale? It must be embarrassing for his friends to see him here. They know about his struggle, and so the recovering alcoholic seeks to extricate himself from the party as quickly and as inauspiciously as possible. He must find an alternative to his former delightful pastime. So handling holidays is tough. Going to synagogue or church, being with an old couple friends, going to parties, anything that brings back the memories of the normal times. Thanksgiving, Christmas, and other such holidays are special, important times in which husbands and wives participate together in creating the customs, traditions, and good times, which make holidays joyful, meaningful, and important. So too, the arrival of New Year's with the anticipation of another year of life together, of new shared experiences, is a downer. Most of the events of a holiday, such as the week between Christmas and New Year, are couple events and also bring tears, bitterness, depression, and loneliness. They also bring memories of good times. So my strategy is to involve myself with others, but not our old couple friends, and keep busy. And I try to remember Christmas as the expression of God's love for us, not just a human festive occasion. Many grieving people view holidays with protest, detachment, or despair. Just as grief and suffering are universal human experiences, so is the presence of hope in the midst of bleakness. Hope allows me to see beyond the pain, beyond the loss, to a deeper reality that provides a broader perspective in which to interpret my pain and loss. Heaven, immortality. Hope is trusting in God's goodness in the midst of aloneness. Because of the promise, we will one day see face to face what we only darkly perceive at the moment. I originally wrote this talk in December 1992, 3 months after Beverly had died. Now it's 3 years later, and I'm still trying to figure it all out. I still don't understand why wonderful, productive people like Beverly and Timothy died prematurely. And I still cringe when experts explain it to me. Someone said, "Don't confuse God with life." And that makes some sense to me. I no longer seek causes. I've become somewhat fatalistic and pragmatic and accept the randomness of life and death. Some die old, some die young. So I'm short on answers, but I do have a sense that our response to loss is important. In my capacity for living enlarged, is my capacity for living enlarged, or has it been diminished? My goal for myself is to use the tragedies of my life in a way to enhance it. This is why I agreed to speak before you tonight. It makes me look at the grief process and integrate it into my life. In some ways, I'm unusual. I know the pain of loss. I've been through the grieving process. I know about the injustice and outrageousness of it all. I know about the rage it causes. So I can listen, empathize, maybe even help. And your letting me talk tonight, I think, enlarges rather than diminishes my life. This is part 4, 15 tips for helping a grieving friend. First, let's talk about how you can deal with clients and others who are grieving. Most of these pointers are common sense and are directed to the caring friend or attorney, not to the casual acquaintance of the bereaved. First, if you want to help, feel free to do so by simply doing something you believe will be helpful. It's not very helpful to say, "Let me know if there's anything I can do." I translate that to mean, I care about you, but if you'll leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. But grieving is individual, and this translation probably isn't fair to the offerer. I don't think it's fair to the offerer personally. Second, don't be afraid to cry openly. If you were close to the deceased, even if the bereaved ends up comforting you, it's helpful. I was touched when an old high school friend called long distance and wept long and openly over the telephone about my loss. Third, talk to the person who has died. Talk about the person who has died. Recall incidents, funny, simple, sad. It's comforting to know that others are sharing your thinking about your loved one, even if it makes the bereaved cry. It's okay. The worst thing is to put the deceased out of your conversation as if he or she never existed. Don't overreact to your friend's tears. Crying is the opposite of laughing, all part of the emotional spectrum and probably a good release. Fifth, don't say, "I know how you feel." You don't. Sixth, don't be too inquisitive about how the death actually happened. Seventh, avoid cliches like the plague. They usually are not on target and usually aren't helpful to hear. "It was God's will," or life is for the living, or God needed her in heaven, etc. Maybe you can say something more helpful if you think about the deceased. 8, recognize that the bereaved may be angry at God, at the person who died, at the doctors, at clergy, at family. 9, if you can take it, just listen and empathize. Your friend may feel guilty and remorseful. Encourage her to talk about it until she can let it go. Same way with depression, let him talk. Maybe he needs counseling. It's okay to suggest it or to be a listening ear. Don't try to fix the pain. 10, be aware of physical reactions to death, lack of appetite, sleeplessness, headaches, inability to concentrate. These may damage the person's coping ability, energy, and recovery. 11, be aware of the use of alcohol and drugs. They may delay or mask the grief. On the other hand, maybe sleeping medication is appropriate. 12, suggest that the bereaved postpone major decisions such as moving or giving assets away. No major decisions for 6 months is a good rule of thumb. 13, take the initiative to get together, recognizing weekends, holiday evenings may be more difficult. 14, encourage your friend to take care of himself during that 3-year period, even if it means breaking away from the former lifestyle. 15, if you didn't know the deceased well, it's helpful to ask your friend or client to tell you about him or her. It helps him to detach and move on to his new life. Conclusion. Holidays are stressful. The grief process is also stressful. It's difficult to generalize about grief. Grieving is as individualized as each individual in the room. Each family member will grieve differently. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. It's governed by our emotional system and the nature of the relationship between the survivor and the deceased. Your helping response depends upon your relationship with the bereaved, and don't be afraid to take the initiative. So that's the paper that my dad wrote, and I'd be interested in some of your reflections or thoughts, or what struck you, or what you heard that maybe was interesting or not.
I mean, one of the things I would suggest is I think he makes a lot of points, particularly a handful of ones in his conclusion that resonate with what we do in Stephen ministry with our Stephen ministers. And I know there's folks here that are prior Stephen ministers. In as much as we spend a couple of sessions, 3-hour sessions on grief and how to minister to folks with Stephen minister on grief. And a number of the points that he made in there are actually right in line with like listening. Don't think you can fix it. Be careful not to offer platitudes and so on. Just empathize and show compassion for the individual and let the individual express whatever feelings they feel comfortable with. I think the idea that you concluded with about, or his idea of, it's different for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think he makes a point in the beginning about, you mentioned the 5 stages of grief. Okay. Well, those stages are real, but they don't happen on a linear scale.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like a tornado. It's like, you may be at one stage here and then you go back to the other stage. You may be done with one stage and return to that stage.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like seasons, if you will, I think, that occur and takes you through it. So I resonated with a number of the points that you made because I think they fall in line specifically with some of our Stephen ministry training. I notice you're nodding, and Mary Margaret as well.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, Mary Margaret.
I was curious as to the timing when his son died and your brother in relationship to when his wife died. Beverly, who's
10 years apart.
And so the son died
First.
Okay.
And that, as he references, was really difficult on their marriage. And then she got cancer, breast cancer, and died. But they sort of plowed through that difficulty.
I think 2 things struck me. One is it's a wonderful analysis on the subject of grief. A lot of things I hadn't thought about, but I haven't been through some of the things that obviously your dad had been. And secondly, it was not an academic treatise. It was told by somebody, it was an analysis by somebody who had lived it. So those 2 things, a wonderful analysis and somebody who spoke from actual experience.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah. I thought also the reference to Nicholas Wolderstorff. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, Lament for a Son. His son, as he says here, just was a very good rock climber and fell and died instantly at age 25. And so Wolderstorff is trying to get his mind around that, losing a son, losing a child.
I would mention there's also a book called The Incomplete One, which is many ministers who've lost a child, and it's the sermons that were given
Oh,
at
wow.
that time. The title is The Incomplete One.
Mhm.
On the death of the-
Death of a child. Yeah, and that's sort of a unique, as you all know, a unique loss, losing a
Right.
child, right? Simon, you had your hand up.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation and your dad's talk. And so deep and so guiding. I like to say that actually depression, it is a healthy thing if you know how to deal with it. And it is so good to deal with it by yourself, because when you cry, you get rid of a lot of stress hormone in your tears. And it is also good to be able to talk to people that you truly, truly trust, and they truly, truly care about you. It is not that other people they don't care about you, but sometimes people are not really advised how to talk to a person who has lost a loved one. Being a Christian, I think it helps a lot if you truly rely on the reading of the Bible and the Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed tells us we don't die. There is an eternity to life, eternal life. You may not see the person, but what is unseen in the book of Mark says it is eternal. So I think that is how I conceive it. Just understanding that my loved ones, two of them, they are with the Lord. And I can, your dad says that he talks to your mom. I do the same thing. I talk to God, I talk to my husband, I talk to my father on a daily basis. I don't see them, but I know they are around. And that helps too. That helps a lot.
Thanks, Simon.
Could I share sorry, it's Wendy in California. I really appreciated your father's presentation, and hearing it coming through you is powerful. I happen to also at this moment be in my mother's childhood home, and it's stirring up all kinds of grief feelings all over again. And it's even making me miss my grandmother, who died 36 years ago. And I really related to that remark that grief is like the spiral, because I'm definitely going through another spiral right now. But I also have a question for you, Pastor Emily, because we know you're actively going through the grief process, grieving your own father right now. And he said that when people say, "How are you doing?" he usually would say, "I'm fine." And I want to ask you very sincerely, how are you doing?
Right. No, I thought his response was good. You don't necessarily want to drag people down into the muck and mire with you when you're not fine. And as Simon just said, you want to do that with folks that you trust, maybe. So yeah, this is one reason I wanted to just sort of have this adult ed today, was because I know many of us are grieving, myself included. And I think that's one thing I would add to his talk is it doesn't matter the age or stage. I often tell this to people, of someone who's died, it's still really hard. If you loved someone, it's still really hard. He was 90 and it was his time, but I'm still a wreck. So it's like, that was a little bit selfishly one reason I wanted to be able to have this class, to be able to talk openly and how we deal with with our own, the things that we carry. And our Stephen ministers are wonderful. I know you're a Stephen minister trained, Wendy, yourself, in walking that journey with us. And we have a lot of resources and tools in this congregation to help people. But yeah, it's hard. I'm still sad. Truly.
I wish I could give you a hug right now, but thank you for sharing that.
That's how it is. So,
one additional observation to the points that your father made would be the following: whether you like it or not, after a grief situation, the world moves on in about 2 weeks.
That's true.
So learn to live with it. Your grief doesn't, but the world has gone on. So whether you're in a law firm, whether you're in business, whether you're at church, everyone else has moved.
But it
That's
takes
true.
time to learn to live with it.
Mhm.
And you never maybe live with it totally. One of the things, I'm gonna share something also in a minute or two, but trauma, which reminds me what you say, permanently changes us. That's one of the things we talk about sometimes in our Stephen ministry. There is no back to the old me. You are different now, full stop, and that goes forever. You can ultimately deal with it, okay, I mean, to your point, Joe, but there's no going back like it never happened. And I think that's something that one, even though the world is true, does continue on, and that's somewhat disheartening. How come nobody else? I'm not feeling too good right now, but everywhere I go, everybody's doing their thing and nobody's worrying about it, after the first week or two of compassionate outreach, maybe. So that's good.
So what I did, when my dad died, I wrote a book of poetry. And I published it. One of my previous professor, my former professor, told me you should do that, you should publish it. So I remember my dad always used to wear a beret, a French hat. So I wrote my first poem was his French hat, how he wore it. And eventually I wrote more and more. And that was, I wouldn't talk to anybody. I didn't want to talk to anybody. And when my dear husband went to God, I wrote another book. And I thought, every time that someone goes to God, it is like it sort of it inspire you to write about them and in their memory. So it would help because you go back to work, of course, but doing something in their honor, and knowing that you're with God, you're not dead. Like if someone asks me that, people they used to come to me and they tell me, we heard that your husband passed away, and it was so offensive. So offensive. I would tell them no. I would get so defensive. I said, no, he's not dead. But we heard he's dead. I said, no, he's with God. He's not dead. He went to God. Yes, it was offensive. And people they say, we heard your husband died. We heard your father died. Well, they are not really dead. Their body is not here, right? But they're always with us.
One other comment I was going to make too is, we have resources. And Sherry, maybe you could comment on some of the resources we have in Stephen Ministry that we offer folks.
Well, and Karen had.
And Karen has.
Karen,
yeah, talk about the brief book.
yeah, I think those are really helpful.
We send out 4 booklets, Journeying Through Grief, and they really go through different stages. We send out the first one that really deals with a lot of your reactions that could be anger or depression or guilt. Maybe you weren't there when your loved one died, or how do you feel in that situation? And in your father's presentation, maybe they hadn't reconciled. And so there may be all different kinds of emotions at the beginning. And so we send out a booklet. It's a time to grieve, just what is going on at that time after about a month. And then we send something out about the 3rd month, and it really deals again with the grief that you're experiencing, all the emotions that you presented in the presentation from your father, all the different kinds of feelings you have. And then the 3rd one is finding hope and healing. And even though you aren't out of the grief stage, and I really like the idea that he presented it as a spiral, because anything can bring you right back to day one. at any time, but yet hopefully there is some healing with what you're experiencing at that time. And that's after about 6 months or 7 months. And that's after everybody has sort of gone home and your world is continuing. And then finally, about the 11th month, this is the fourth book, that rebuilding and remembering. And it really deals with the firsts during that first year, you know, all of your birthdays or different kinds of traditions that you had, or Christmases, you know, and just trying to get through those different anniversaries and what you're feeling and trying to rebuild in some way that makes sense to you. So we send these out to people that are grieving in our congregation, and they have found it at different times to be really helpful, because that's really what people are going through at that time, and the whole grief process. I think also one of the things that I liked about your father's presentation, not the fact that, the fact that he expressed so many emotions, but when he said we deal so much with life and the giving up of life or the loss of life, when God is far bigger than that, as you were saying. And so maybe we need to look at more than just that, you know, even like in your presentations, when you talk about he's found the full experience of God, you know, that there's something more than just the loss that maybe can help us get through it.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing those grief books, Karen. Those are, I know people have found those very helpful at the different, they come right at the 3 month, 6 month, 11 month, 3 weeks, 6 month. Anyway, and good markers for when people are really needing those.
We also have care notes, which there's several back there, and we try to change them every so often, but right now they focus mostly on grieving. And thank you for the presentation. I think it's really important to continue to talk about the person, what your dad said. And even my father died several years ago, but even now to talk about him or to hear stories, it's very comforting.
You don't want to act like they never existed. Right. They were part of your life, and you have short stories to share, and it's very important to talk about.
And I think sometimes, just to add to that, when you're trying to be empathetic to the person that has lost a loved one, a spouse or whatever, the tendency that people may feel, I'm just talking in average terms, is I don't want to bring the subject up because I'm afraid I'm gonna have the person's gonna feel that hurt. Well, let's just talk about something else. But in reality, and the point Sherry made too, the opposite is true. While you bring it up, and it may bring a few tears to the individual, but that's a good thing. And it also shows that you are empathetic and very compassionate toward, understanding. It's in your mind as well as the person's mind. And so it can be reassuring in sort of a strange way to actually bring it up. The other thing I want to mention too quickly is that to Karen's point about, over periods of time, and I just wanted, this is another thing we sometimes share during our Steve ministry training. I'll just read this. Surviving trauma with the loss of a loved one, or any trauma for that matter, but we're talking about grief and the loss of a loved one, takes firefighters and builders. Very few people are both. Surviving trauma requires at least two types of people: the crisis team, those friends who can drop everything and jump into the fray by your side, and the reconstruction crew, those whose calm, steady care will help nudge you out the door into regaining your footing in the world. And when we go through our Steve ministry training, again, there's a number of people in the room who resonate with this. Steve minister are really the reconstruction crew. They're there for the long haul. After, the immediate, memorial service, friendships, and the crisis team kind of jumps into the fray, if you will, just to use these words. So I think it's interesting, again, when we're trying to administer and support those that are grieving, to understand that. And to some extent, even these grief booklets spread over a year. I mean, because it lasts often longer than a year, but again, it's the long term where we want to be sensitive and support folks.
I wanted to thank you, Emily, for reading your father's. It was wonderful, and I resonated with lots of it, but a couple things on the humorous part. I remember our son, who is Darcy's brother, like when he says a friend whose grandmother died, and then, well, what did you expect? You know? But then there is a humor, because then when something happens, you think, well, it's not that bad because, hey, nobody died. You know? So it gives you a better perspective on things in life, and it helps you deal with what to someone else. Oh my gosh, this is awful. And you think, well, nobody died, so it's not that bad. And the other thing I resonated is when I spoke, I had a hard time talking to Bobby Hartzog, and I was crying, and she, like, you know, she gave me comfort.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I could hardly talk to her.
About Bill's death.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And so that is something that you can resonate with. for sure. And then, of course, we're very lucky. We have a scholarship that's given in memory of our daughter, and that really helps. Yeah.
Name it.
I agree with Mary Margaret. I resonate to the humor that your father found, and Louise knows. My father's been gone for a long time, but when we bring up his name, it's not in sadness, but rather he used to love to tell stories about his time in the Army in the South Pacific. And he told those stories hundreds of times. So I can make Louise and our daughter Sarah by saying, did I ever tell you about the snake in the gun pit? It was a classic story from my father. You know, that sort of puts him in perspective and how we remember.
And our answer to him every time he asked us was, yes.
Yeah.
Bobby."
You've heard it 100 times. Tell it again.
And it's sort of, in a sense, your father's living on. The point that you were making before. I mean, those little things living on in your family's minds and so on. That's a good thing. So it becomes a joy ultimately. Yeah, I mean, from the standpoint of those memories. Yeah, it's not necessarily the loss, but the standpoint of the memories.
There is a poem by a Scottish bishop, Scott Henry, that death is nothing at all. I don't remember all it is a beautiful poem after the king died. So he wrote that because people are very sad. Yeah. Beautiful.
Would like to put in good words for the books that Karen was talking about. They were exactly what I needed. Yeah, I needed it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is
Thank you.
helpful to hear, Bobby. Thank you for chiming in on that as a recipient of some of the books. Yeah.
Yes.
I was thinking when you said, I'm fine, in Stephen Ministry, we talk about feelings I'm not expressing. So, but I think you can't really, as you said, express them to everyone. You need to save that for someone to give you support.
Yeah. And sometimes his point was sometimes people don't want to hear it. I think in a church, people maybe do want to hear it. I think we have an atmosphere here where people really do want to hear how people are doing, and it's not just that sort of cursory, I'm fine, but we want to cultivate that in this environment, that honest sharing, how things are going. Rob?
Emily, first of all, I think I'm amazed at the household you grew up in, and I think it had some foreshadowing of you being a great pastor today. So I just want to say that, but I love the way your father, interspersed the personal human side of it and then the more mental side, but it really resonated with me. So I lost my father when I was in my 20s, and but many of the things he talked about, the anger, it was amazing to me. We had next door neighbors that had kids. We had 4 kids, 2 kids for us, 2 kids for them. We're all in our 20s, and but actually we weren't really close to him, but we knew him quite well. And he didn't have a great relationship with his father, and it was just amazing. His father would come over on a Sunday afternoon, and And my neighbor and his father would be in the driveway talking, and it was just, I would just get angry seeing them, and I'm like, he isn't even that close to his father, and so I just, having your father describe the angers, I went through that. And then the other part of it was the, telling the stories, like we have, my parents' next door neighbors are good friends of Karen and mine. We see them and often we'll just be talking, they'll just tell a story about my father. And it's like, it is really very life affirming to hear stories that someone knew your father, even though he died almost 40 years ago. And then they'll tell a story, often they're funny and everything, but those are, so I thought you probably captured pretty well some of the human aspects that he was going through.
Thanks for saying that, Rob. Yeah, and one thing I think maybe, John, did you have your hand up? No, one thing I think maybe is helpful, and all of it, many of us have touched on it, is not being afraid to name the name and not being afraid to say talk about the deceased. And if the person doesn't want to talk about it, maybe they'll make that known too, that not just necessarily shy away from the tears. I know sometimes I have said, I just can't talk about it because I know it'll sort of break me up, and that's honest. But sometimes it's helpful to hear someone else name the name and say, as you're saying, when your neighbors talk about your parents or your dad, that just to hear that name named. And as Mary Margaret was saying, annually we name Darcy because of the endowment, or now with the Russo endowment, we name Jennifer, sort of saying the name of the deceased, and that's okay, even though it's sad and it's hard.
Yeah, and I was gonna also, along those same lines, one of the things that I have here too is recommendation. Presence is always better than distance in terms of dealing with folks who have undergone grief. There's a curious illusion that at times of crisis, people need space. Now, they may for periods of time, but the punchline sort of is, it's much lighter. It's a much lighter burden to say, from the point of view of the person grieving, thanks for your love, but please go away. I need some space now, than to say, I was hurting and no one cared for me.
Yeah.
Okay, if someone says they need space, respect that. Otherwise, err on the side of presence. And it kind of couples into your point, Emily, on social. In fact, there was another thing, and actually when we talked about this at Steve Ministry, grieving is a social, is social, and so is healing. And I just kind of think back too, we've all had these kind of experiences, being alone or feeling alone, and then this tremendous pain. It's like the worst thing you can go through. You can't get rid of the pain, you have to go through it. But having other people with you at different times and showing, just being present, maybe not necessarily saying something, but just knowing that they're there, can be very helpful.
Some people don't know how to handle, don't know what to say.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's more hurtful, in people not mentioning a name or the situation. When we lived in Miami, I lost a baby and I was teaching. So I was surrounded by a school of people who knew that and already had a baby shower and stuff. But after I lost the baby, it was, oh, well, you're young, you can have more children. That's the hardest thing to hear. But just that distance of people not really, you almost feel that they don't care about you. That was difficult.
You need to be named. I know that there are some, that's from hospice, Sherry, a handout for dealing with grief. And then, as Sherry mentioned, the grief notes are there. If you know of someone that, could maybe use some encouragement.
Here's some copies.
We're going to go into our worship service being led now by our Stephen leaders and Stephen ministers. So we look forward to what Bob and Karen and Sherry will be, we'll sort of be continuing the conversation today in worship. So thank you all for joining, those who are with us online and those who are here. We're going to go into worship.